Beneath the canopy of the Cambodian jungle, hidden under roots thicker than a grown man's torso, there lies a city that once held more than 1 million people. Not a village, not a town, a city. A sprawling, breathing metropolis, larger than any capital in medieval Europe. A city whose water management system was so advanced that modern hydrologists still study its design. A city whose temples are so precisely aligned with the heavens that astronomers have verified their accuracy using modern instruments. And almost no one alive today, outside a small community of scholars and Cambodian monks, can tell you what happened to it. Almost no one can tell you why the streets fell silent. Almost no one can tell you how a civilization of such extraordinary power simply ceased to function and allowed the forest to swallow everything it had built. The Khmer Empire, at its height, ruled over a territory stretching across modern-day Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Its capital, Angkor, covered more than 1,000 square kilometers. That is roughly the size of modern-day Los Angeles. But unlike Los Angeles, Angkor was built without steel, without concrete, without combustion engines, without powered machinery of any kind. Its people carved it from sandstone and laterite, quarried blocks weighing several tons, and moved them across rivers and forests using rope, muscle, and ingenuity. They constructed temples so precise in their alignment that they mirror constellations overhead. They dug reservoirs so vast they are visible from orbiting satellites. They did all of this more than 800 years ago. And then, within the span of a few generations, it was over. The population scattered, the reservoirs silted up, the temples cracked under the pressure of strangler fig roots. The jungle, patient and relentless, swallowed everything. Streets that once echoed with the voices of priests, merchants, dancers, and kings fell silent. And the silence lasted for centuries, when European explorers stumbled upon Angkor Wat in the 19th century. They could not believe that the people living in the surrounding villages had built it. Some refused to accept that any civilization in Southeast Asia could have achieved such grandeur. They speculated that the temples must have been built by Romans, or by Alexander the Great, or by some other civilization they already knew and respected. They were wrong, of course. Profoundly, embarrassingly wrong. But their disbelief tells us something important about how quickly we forget, not just names and dates, but entire worlds, entire civilizations, entire ways of being human. We forget that civilizations are not permanent. We forget that cities fall. We forget that knowledge, once lost, does not return on its own. The Khmer Empire is one of the most dramatic examples of this truth in all of human history. At its peak, it was among the most powerful, most sophisticated, and most densely populated civilizations on the planet. And today, most people could not place it on a map. Most people have never heard the names of its kings. Most people do not know that its engineers created the largest pre-industrial urban network ever discovered. The temples survive, yes. Angkor Wat appears on postcards and travel brochures. Tourists take photographs in front of its towers at sunrise. But the civilization that built it, the living, breathing empire of scholars and soldiers and farmers and dancers and priests, that civilization is gone. Not conquered, not relocated, gone. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand how the Khmer Empire rose to become one of the greatest powers the world has ever known, why it collapsed so suddenly, that even its own descendants lost the memory of its grandeur, and what its fall reveals about the fragility of every civilization, including our own. This is a story about stone and water, about ambition and entropy, about the thin line between triumph and oblivion. It is a story that begins in the monsoon forests of Southeast Asia and ends in a question that none of us can avoid. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand what was lost in the jungles of Cambodia, we first need to understand what was built. And to understand what was built, we need to understand the scale of time, labor, and ambition involved. Because what the Khmer achieved was not simply impressive for its era. It was impressive by any standard. It would be impressive if someone built it today. The story of the Khmer Empire begins by most scholarly accounts in the year 802 of the Common Era. That is the date traditionally assigned to the reign of Jayavarman II, the king who unified the warring principalities of the region and declared himself a universal monarch, a Devaraja, a god-king. He established his court near the area that would eventually become Angkor. But the roots of Khmer civilizations stretch much further back than that. Archaeological evidence from the Mekong Delta and the Tonle Sap Basin suggests that complex societies had existed in the region for centuries before Jayavarman II's coronation. These were communities that understood irrigation. They traded with India and China. They practiced Hinduism and Buddhism in overlapping waves of devotion. They built in wood and brick and earth. They were sophisticated, connected, and ambitious. What Jayavarman II did was not create Khmer culture from nothing. He consolidated it. He gave it a political center and a sacred legitimacy that would endure for 600 years. And from that center, over the next 6 centuries, the Khmer would build something that the world had rarely seen before and has rarely seen since. Consider the numbers, and consider them carefully. The Angkor complex, as mapped by modern LiDAR surveys conducted by the Cambodian Archaeological LiDAR Initiative beginning in 2012, covers an area of approximately 1,000 square kilometers. 1,000. To put that in perspective, medieval London at its largest covered roughly 3 square kilometers. Paris, in the 13th century, covered perhaps 5 square kilometers within its walls. Rome, at the height of its imperial glory, encompassed only about 14 square kilometers within the Aurelian walls. Constantinople, the greatest city of the medieval world, covered about 13 square kilometers. Angkor dwarfed them all. It was not a city in the way we typically think of cities, a dense cluster of buildings surrounded by a wall. It was an urban landscape, a sprawling interconnected network of temples, reservoirs, canals, roads, residential zones, rice paddies, orchards, and waterways, all linked by one of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering systems ever devised. The math is striking. If you were to walk from the western edge of the Angkor complex to the eastern edge at a steady pace of 5 kilometers per hour, it would take you roughly 3 full days of walking. If you were to count every temple, every shrine, every carved lintel within the complex, the number would exceed 1,000 individual structures. And these are only the ones that have survived, the ones built from stone and laterite. Archaeologists believe that many more structures, built from wood and other perishable materials, have been lost entirely to erosion, decay, and the slow crush of vegetation over centuries. The central temple, Angkor Wat, is the largest religious monument on the planet. Not the largest in Southeast Asia, not the largest of its type, the largest anywhere ever built by any civilization in any era of human history. Its moat alone stretches 190 meters wide and runs for more than 5 kilometers in total circumference. Filling that moat required an estimated 1.5 million cubic meters of earth to be excavated, moved, and shaped, all by hand. The temple rises in a series of concentric galleries to a central tower that stands 65 meters above the ground, roughly the height of a 20-story building. Its walls are covered with nearly 2,000 square meters of bas-relief carvings. These are intricate depictions of Hindu mythology, battle scenes from the great epics, celestial dances known as apsaras, and scenes of everyday Khmer life. The detail is astonishing. Individual figures have distinct facial expressions. Warriors carry weapons that can be identified by type and period. Dancers wear jewelry that corresponds to specific historical periods and social ranks. Scholars have spent entire careers studying single panels of these reliefs and still find new details. These carvings were not mere decorations. They were records. They were the Khmer way of writing history in stone, preserving their mythology, their military triumphs, and their vision of the cosmos for future generations. The irony, of course, is that the future generations they imagined never came to read them. But Angkor Wat, for all its fame, was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The Bayon, built by Jayavarman VII in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, features over 200 enormous stone faces gazing out in every direction, each face roughly 2 meters high, each with a gentle, enigmatic smile. Scholars have debated for decades whether these faces represent the Buddha, the king himself, or the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, or perhaps a deliberate fusion of all three. The ambiguity may be the point. The Bayon was built at the center of Angkor Thom, a walled city within the larger urban landscape of Angkor. Its walls enclosed an area of 9 square kilometers, and its gates were crowned with the same mysterious smiling faces. Approaching Angkor Thom from any direction, a visitor would have been greeted by those serene, inscrutable expressions, looking down from above, as if the city itself were alive and watching. Ta Prohm, the temple famously left partially unrested, shows what happens when nature reclaims human ambition. Its walls buckle under the embrace of silk cotton trees and strangler figs. Roots cascade over carved stone like frozen waterfalls. Doorways are framed not by lintels, but by the living wood of trees that have been growing for centuries, slowly pulling the temple apart while simultaneously holding it together. Without the trees, the walls would collapse. With them, the temple is caught in a perpetual process of destruction and preservation, each root both supporting and undermining the stone it grips. Preah Khan was built as a monastery and university, a place of learning that housed more than 1,000 teachers. According to inscription evidence, Bante Sray, the so-called Citadel of Women, is a smaller temple renowned for the extraordinary delicacy of its carvings, considered by many to be the finest in all of Khmer art. Neak Peen is a small temple set on an artificial island in the middle of a reservoir, designed to represent the mythical lake Anavatapta and used for ritual purification. The list goes on. Each temple tells a different story. Each represents a different king, a different era, a different theological vision, a different chapter in a 600-year-long conversation between humanity and the divine. And all of this, every temple, every city, every field of rice, was supported by water. The hydraulic system of Angkor is in many ways more impressive than the temples themselves. The Khmer built enormous reservoirs called barrays. The largest of these, the West Barray, measures roughly 8 kilometers long and 2.3 kilometers wide. It could hold more than 50 million cubic meters of water. This was not a natural lake. It was entirely engineered, dug by hand, lined with embankments of compacted earth that rose several meters above the surrounding terrain. The West Barray alone is visible from space. It is so large that standing on one shore, you cannot see the opposite bank, and it was only one of several. The East Barray, slightly older but nearly as large, the Indratataka, and numerous smaller reservoirs and tanks formed a network that captured monsoon rains, stored them through the dry season, and distributed them through a web of canals to the rice paddies that fed the empire. This water system was not a luxury. It was not a monument to royal vanity. It was the foundation of everything, the absolute prerequisite for the empire's existence. The Khmer Empire existed in a monsoon climate, one of the most extreme and unpredictable climate patterns on the planet. Half the year brought torrential rains and catastrophic flooding. The other half brought severe drought. Without the barrays and canals, the population of Angkor could never have grown beyond a few thousand subsistence farmers. With them, it sustained, according to recent estimates by researchers at the University of Sydney's Greater Angkor Project, between 750,000 and 1 million people at its peak. Some scholars, including Damien Evans, who led the LiDAR survey team, have argued that the number may have been even higher, perhaps as many as 1,200,000. The exact figure remains debated, but the order of magnitude is clear. This was a city on a scale that medieval Europe could not have imagined. Let that comparison settle for a moment. In the 12th century, while London had a population of perhaps 18,000 to 20,000 people, while Paris held maybe 50,000, while the great cities of Europe were cramped, disease-ridden settlements surrounded by mud walls and open sewers, the Khmer had built a metropolis that may have exceeded 1 million souls. They fed this population with a rice surplus generated by their hydraulic engineering. Some researchers estimate that the water system allowed for 2 or even 3 rice harvests per year, compared to the single harvest that rain-fed agriculture could support. They clothed their people with textiles from a sophisticated weaving tradition. They governed them through a complex administrative system of provinces, districts, and temple estates, each with defined roles, obligations, and revenue streams. They connected them with roads that ran for hundreds of kilometers across the empire, lined with rest houses for travelers, spaced at intervals of roughly 15 kilometers, about a day's walk apart. More than 120 rest houses have been identified along the major Khmer road networks. The empire's reach extended far beyond its capital. At its greatest territorial extent, under Jayavarman VII in the late 12th century, the Khmer controlled most of mainland Southeast Asia. Inscriptions and archaeological remains have been found in modern-day Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and even parts of Myanmar and the Malay Peninsula. Trade goods associated with the Khmer have been identified as far away as China, India, and the Middle East. Chinese diplomats who visited Angkor wrote detailed accounts of what they saw, descriptions that confirm the grandeur and sophistication that the ruins still hint at today. One of the most important of these accounts was written by Zhou de Guan, a Chinese envoy who visited Angkor in 1296 and stayed for approximately 11 months. His record, titled The Customs of Cambodia, is one of the few surviving eyewitness descriptions of the empire in its later period. He describes a thriving city of wooden houses raised on stilts to protect against flooding, a royal palace with golden window frames and tiles of lead and clay, markets bustling with trade, where goods were exchanged by both men and women, religious ceremonies of extraordinary complexity. He describes a society stratified by rank, but interconnected by commerce. He notes the presence of scholars, astrologers, and physicians. He describes the king's procession, with elephants adorned in gold, soldiers bearing lances tipped with iron, musicians playing drums and horns, and women of the court carrying parasols and fans. It is the portrait of a civilization at its height, confident, prosperous, and deeply aware of its own grandeur. But Zhu Daguan also hints at trouble. He mentions warfare on the borders, particularly with the Thai kingdoms to the west. He notes that the temples, even in his time, were already showing signs of neglect in certain areas. He observes that some of the great building projects had been abandoned mid-construction. These are small details, almost throwaway lines in his account, but in hindsight, they read like the first cracks in a dam, the first signs that the system was beginning to strain. To study the Khmer Empire is to study the relationship between human ingenuity and the natural world. The Khmer did not fight against their environment in the way that modern civilizations often do. They did not attempt to eliminate the monsoon or flatten the landscape. Instead, they reshaped it. They turned a landscape of seasonal floods and droughts into one of the most productive agricultural zones on the planet. They carved gods from mountain stone and set them in temples aligned with the movements of the sun and stars. They created a civilization that lasted more than 600 years, a span roughly equal to the entire period from the signing of the Magna Carta to the present day. If the Khmer Empire were founded today, it would not end until the 27th century, and then it ended, not with a single catastrophic event, not with an invasion that burned everything to the ground, not with a plague that killed everyone overnight. The end of the Khmer Empire was slower than that, and in many ways more troubling, because it suggests that the forces that destroy civilizations are not always visible. They are not always dramatic. Sometimes the collapse is so gradual that the people living through it do not realize what is happening until it is too late. Sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones that arrive not as a storm, but as a slow change in the weather. The question that haunts every archaeologist who has worked at Angkor is not just what happened, but how. How does a city of 1 million people empty? How does a civilization that built the largest religious monument on Earth lose the knowledge and the will to maintain it? How does an empire that controlled most of mainland Southeast Asia shrink to a shadow of itself within a few lifetimes? Something is deeply wrong with our assumptions about civilizational permanence, and the story of the Khmer Empire is one of the most powerful challenges to those assumptions ever uncovered. What scientists discovered next was worse than anyone expected. The traditional narrative of the Khmer Empire's fall is deceptively simple. For decades, historians told it like this. In 1431, the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya sacked Angkor. The Khmer court fled south to Phnom Penh. The capital was abandoned. The jungle moved in. End of story. Clean, tidy. The kind of narrative that fits in a textbook paragraph. But the problem with this narrative is that it does not hold up under scrutiny. Not even close. The Thai did attack Angkor. That much is clear from both Thai and Cambodian chronicles, though the exact dates and details differ between the two traditions. But the idea that a single military defeat, however devastating, could erase a civilization of this scale strains belief to the breaking point. Cities have been sacked throughout history. Rome was sacked by the Visigoths in 410, by the Vandals in 455, and by various forces several more times after that. Each time, the city survived and eventually recovered. Baghdad was devastated by the Mongols under Hulagu Khan in 1258 in one of the most destructive sieges in history. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of people were killed and the city's legendary libraries were destroyed. Yet, Baghdad survived. It was rebuilt. It continued as a major center of Islamic civilization for centuries afterward. Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 and became Istanbul. The city did not die. It transformed. The pattern of history suggests that a single military event, no matter how devastating, rarely destroys a civilization on its own. It damages it, weakens it, forces it to reorganize, perhaps to relocate. But it does not erase it. Something more is required for that. Something deeper, something structural. So what actually happened to Angkor? The answer, as it has emerged from decades of painstaking archaeological research, remote sensing surveys, and environmental analysis, is far more complex, far more gradual, and far more unsettling than the old story of a sudden military defeat. It involves water, climate, religion, politics, economics, demographics, and the slow accumulation of problems too large and too interconnected to solve. It is a story not of catastrophe but of entropy, the gradual unwinding of a system that had once been brilliantly engineered, but whose vulnerabilities accumulated over centuries until the whole structure could no longer hold. The first and most important clue came from the water. In the 1990s and 2000s, a team of researchers led by Roland Fletcher from the University of Sydney and Christophe Potier from the École Française d'Extrême-Orient began using aerial photography and, later, LiDAR technology to map the full extent of the Angkor hydraulic network. LiDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging, uses laser pulses fired from aircraft to create detailed three-dimensional maps of the ground surface, penetrating the jungle canopy to reveal features invisible from the ground or from conventional aerial photographs. The technology had been used in forestry and geology, but had never been applied to archaeology on this scale. What they found was staggering. The water system was far larger and far more complex than anyone had previously understood. It was not just a collection of reservoirs and canals. It was an integrated landscape-scale engineering project that managed water flow across hundreds of square kilometers, capturing monsoon rain, directing it into reservoirs, distributing it through a network of primary and secondary canals, and draining excess water away from populated areas. The system had multiple layers of redundancy. If one canal failed, water could be rerouted through others. If a reservoir overflowed, spillways directed the excess into designated flood zones. It was, in every meaningful sense, a machine made of earth, water, and gravity, designed to tame the monsoon and turn its destructive power into the productive energy that fed 1 million people. But the LiDAR scans also revealed something else, something that the researchers had not expected. They showed evidence of massive erosion and sedimentation in the canal network. They showed breaches in embankments that had been repaired, breached again, and repaired again, in cycles that suggested decades or even centuries of struggle to maintain the system. They showed areas where canals had been rerouted, dams heightened, overflow channels added, and entirely new channels cut, in what appeared to be increasingly desperate attempts to keep the water flowing where it needed to go. The picture that emerged was one of a hydraulic system under chronic escalating stress. The system had been designed to handle the monsoon cycle of the region, the extreme alternation between wet and dry seasons that defines Cambodia's climate. But it had been designed for a particular range of conditions, a range that the original engineers had observed over their lifetimes and assumed would continue. If those conditions changed, even slightly, the system would come under pressure. If the monsoons became more intense than usual, the reservoirs would overflow and the embankments would erode. If the monsoons weakened or became more erratic, the reservoirs would not fill completely, and the dry season would bring water shortages to the paddies and the population that depended on them. And it gets worse, much worse. Tree ring data from Southeast Asia, painstakingly analysed by Brendan Buckley of Columbia University and Kevin Antiochitis of the University of Arizona, revealed that the 14th and 15th centuries were a period of extreme climate instability in the region. The data, drawn from ancient Vietnamese cypress trees and other long-lived species, shows a pattern of alternating mega-droughts and mega-monsoons. These were swings in precipitation far outside the normal range, far beyond anything the original Khmer engineers could have anticipated or designed for. The longest drought identified in the tree ring record lasted from roughly 1340 to 1370, nearly 3 decades of below normal rainfall. 3 decades, an entire generation growing up in conditions of water scarcity, watching the reservoirs drop year after year, watching the rice paddies crack and dry. This prolonged drought was followed by periods of unusually heavy monsoons that would have flooded the already weakened infrastructure. Embankments that had been eroded by years of insufficient maintenance and reduced water pressure were suddenly hit with volumes of water they could no longer contain. Canals that had partially silted up during the dry years lacked the capacity to handle the sudden influx. The result was not a controlled flow of water from reservoir to paddy. It was chaos, flooding in some areas, drought in others. A system that had once operated like a finely tuned instrument now lurching between extremes it was never designed to handle. Imagine the effect of this on a city of nearly 1 million people whose entire food supply depended on a hydraulic system designed for average conditions. The droughts would have reduced rice yields dramatically. A single poor harvest is a hardship. 2 consecutive poor harvests is a crisis. 5 or 10 consecutive poor harvests is a catastrophe that threatens the very survival of the community. The subsequent floods would have damaged the very infrastructure needed to recover from the drought. And all of this would have happened over a period of decades, long enough for the population to experience creeping famine, social unrest, migration away from the worst affected areas, and a growing loss of faith in the system's ability to provide. This is not speculation. The archaeological evidence supports it directly. Excavations at Angkor have revealed that the western section of the city's canal network suffered catastrophic failures in the 14th and 15th centuries. The so-called Southwest Canal, a major artery of the water distribution system, shows evidence of having been blocked by a massive sediment deposit that was never cleared. The channel was simply abandoned, left to fill with mud and vegetation. The implications of this single failure are profound. If one major canal is lost, the water that should have flowed through it backs up or diverts into unintended channels. Other canals receive more water than their designed capacity. They erode. They breach. Adjacent areas flood, while areas downstream of the blockage go dry. The failure cascades through the network, each broken element placing greater stress on the remaining components. Mary Beth Day, a hydrologist at the University of Cambridge who studied Angkor's water system as part of the Greater Angkor project, has described this process as a cascade of infrastructure failure. Each break in the system placed greater stress on the remaining components. Each repair was a temporary fix that did not address the underlying problem, and the underlying problem was twofold. First, the climate had shifted in ways the original engineers could not have anticipated. Second, the scale of the system, the very quality that had made it so effective, now made comprehensive repair or redesign effectively impossible. There was no way to shut down a 1,000 square kilometre water network for repairs. There was no way to reroute the monsoon while you fixed the canals. The system had to be maintained while it was running, and it was running on conditions it was not designed for. But the water crisis was not the only force at work. It was layered on top of political instability, religious transformation, economic shifts, and demographic pressures that together created a perfect storm of decline. Politically, the Khmer Empire in its final centuries was racked by succession disputes and internal conflict. The Khmer did not have a fixed rule of primogeniture, the automatic succession of the eldest son. The throne could pass through both paternal and maternal lines, and rival claimants frequently contested the succession through intrigue, alliance building, and outright warfare. In a stable and prosperous era, these succession disputes could be managed. In an era of drought, failing infrastructure, and declining rice yields, they became destabilizing. Resources that should have gone to infrastructure maintenance were diverted to military campaigns. Political energy that should have been focused on managing the water crisis was consumed by factional struggles. The religious transformation that swept the Khmer world during this period added another layer of disruption. For centuries, the Khmer state had been organized around the Devaraja cult, the concept of the god king. The king was not merely a political ruler, he was a manifestation of the divine, linked to the Hindu gods Shiva or Vishnu through elaborate rituals of consecration. The great temples of Angkor were built as physical expressions of this divine kingship, each one a representation of Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the center of the universe in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology. The temple building program was not vanity. It was theology. It was statecraft. It was the physical foundation of royal legitimacy. The transition from Hindu to Theravada Buddhist practice, which accelerated in the 13th and 14th centuries, was not merely a change in prayer and ritual. It was a restructuring of the entire social, political, and economic order. Theravada Buddhism, with its emphasis on individual merit, monastic simplicity, personal meditation, and the rejection of divine kingship, undermined the ideological foundation that had supported the Khmer state for centuries. Kings, who had once commanded the resources of an entire civilization for massive temple-building projects, now found their authority challenged by a new religious framework that valued humility over grandeur and personal spiritual practice over state ritual. The elaborate temple-state system, in which vast agricultural estates were dedicated to the maintenance of temples and the feeding of thousands of priests, dancers, musicians, and attendants, was enormously expensive. It required constant surpluses of rice, labor, and materials. As the hydraulic system faltered and rice yields declined, the economic base that supported this system eroded. The shift to Theravada Buddhism can be seen in part as an adaptation, a move toward a less materially demanding form of religious practice that was better suited to a society with fewer resources. But it was also a cause of further disruption because it withdrew legitimacy from the very institution, the divine kingship, that had previously coordinated the empire's response to crisis. Economically, the empire was also being squeezed by changes in regional trade patterns. The rise of maritime commerce in Southeast Asia, centered on the Strait of Malacca and the coastal ports of the Malay Peninsula and Vietnam, drew economic activity away from the inland centers of power that the Khmer had dominated. Angkor was a river city, connected to the sea by the Tonle Sap and the Mekong, but it was not a port city. As maritime trade became more important in the regional economy, the coastal kingdoms gained wealth and influence at the expense of inland empires. The Thai kingdoms to the west, particularly Ayutthaya, founded around 1351, were better positioned to take advantage of these new trade routes. They grew stronger as the Khmer grew weaker, a dynamic that had as much to do with economics as with military prowess. So when the Thai finally did attack Angkor in the mid-15th century, they were not destroying a thriving empire at its peak. They were delivering a blow to a system already weakened by decades of climate stress, infrastructure failure, political fragmentation, religious upheaval, and economic decline. The sack of Angkor was not the cause of the collapse. It was the final act in a process that had been unfolding for over a century. It was the storm that brought down a tree already hollowed from within. The court's relocation to the Phnom Penh area, closer to the coast and to maritime trade networks, was not merely a retreat. It was an acknowledgement, conscious or not, that the inland hydraulic model of civilization, the model that had sustained the Khmer for 600 years, was no longer viable in the conditions that now prevailed. The new capital was smaller, more modest, and more connected to the emerging economic realities of maritime Southeast Asia. Angkor, meanwhile, was not entirely abandoned overnight. Angkor Wat itself continued to function as a Buddhist monastery for centuries after the court's departure. Monks lived in its galleries, pilgrims visited its shrines, local people farmed in its shadow. But the vast urban network around the temple, the residential areas, the markets, the administrative centres, the extensive rice paddies, the canal system, all of this was gradually reclaimed by the forest. Within decades, the wooden structures would have rotted. Within a century, trees would have taken root in the stone temples. Within 2 or 3 centuries, the entire complex would have been unrecognizable from the air. A series of mounds and ridges in the forest, distinguishable from natural terrain only by the occasional glimpse of carved stone through the undergrowth. When the French naturalist Henri Mouhot visited the site in 1860, he was astonished by what he found. His published accounts and sketches brought Angkor to the attention of the Western world and sparked a wave of European fascination that continues to this day. But Mouhot did not discover Angkor. That is a colonial myth. The local Cambodian people had always known it was there. Monks had maintained Angkor Wat as a place of worship through all the centuries of supposed abandonment. What Mouhot discovered was Europe's ignorance of it, and that ignorance itself was a kind of lesson, a demonstration of how thoroughly a great civilization can be lost to the wider world, even when its ruins remain standing. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The Khmer Empire is not unique, it is not an anomaly. It is not the only great civilization to have been swallowed by the natural world and lost to human memory. It is merely one of the most dramatic examples of a pattern that has repeated itself across every inhabited continent, across thousands of years, with a consistency that should give every thinking person pause. The fall of the Khmer Empire is not an isolated event. It belongs to a larger and deeply troubling pattern in human history, a pattern of complex societies reaching extraordinary heights of achievement and then collapsing, sometimes so completely that even their names are lost. To understand what happened at Angkor, we need to look at these parallel cases. Not to find a single explanation that fits them all, because no single explanation exists, but to see the common threads that run through stories of civilizational disappearance across continents and centuries. To ask whether the forces that destroyed Khmer are unique to the Khmer, or whether they represent something fundamental about the nature of complex societies. The first case is one of the oldest and most perplexing mysteries in all of archaeology. In the Indus River Valley, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, a civilization flourished from roughly 2600 to 1900 before the Common Era, according to current archaeological dating. This civilization, known as the Harappan civilization after one of its major excavated cities, was vast. It covered an area of approximately 1,300,000 square kilometers, larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. At its height, it may have encompassed as many as 5 million people, making it the largest civilization on the planet during its era. Its 2 great cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, were marvels of urban planning that have few parallels in the ancient world. Streets were laid out on a precise grid pattern, oriented along cardinal directions. Houses were built of standardized, kiln-fired bricks in consistent proportions, the same ratio of length to width to height, maintained across hundreds of settlements spanning hundreds of kilometers. This level of standardization is extraordinary. It implies either a central authority dictating building codes, or a shared cultural tradition so deeply embedded that it produced uniformity without enforcement. Houses had indoor plumbing, a feature that would not become standard in Europe for thousands of years afterward. Drains ran from individual homes into covered sewers that ran beneath the streets, channeling wastewater away from residential areas. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, a large rectangular pool lined with bitumen for waterproofing and surrounded by colonnaded rooms, suggests a society that placed high value on ritual cleanliness and communal bathing. The Harappans traded with Mesopotamia, their distinctive square seals, carved with images of animals, including the famous unicorn seal, and inscribed with a script that has never been deciphered, have been found at sites across the ancient Near East. They worked in copper, bronze, gold, silver, and semi-precious stones. Their pottery was standardized across settlements spanning vast distances, suggesting a degree of cultural or administrative unity that is extraordinary for its time. They developed a system of standardized weights and measures, with small stone cubes precisely cut to specific masses following a mathematical ratio, and their writing system, the Indus script, remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of archaeology. More than 4,000 examples of the script have been found, carved on seals, pottery, tablets, and copper implements. But no bilingual inscription, no Rosetta Stone, has ever been discovered. Without such a key, the script remains unreadable. We cannot determine what language the Harappans spoke. We do not know the names of their rulers, if they had rulers in the conventional sense. We do not know their myths, their laws, their histories, their songs. An entire civilization's voice has been silenced. And then, around 1900 before the Common Era, the cities were abandoned. Mohenjo-Daro shows signs of declining maintenance in its final phases. Streets were no longer repaired. Houses were subdivided into smaller units, suggesting overcrowding or a breakdown in social organization. Fine craftsmanship gave way to cruder work. The trade networks contracted. The population drifted away, moving east and south into smaller, less complex settlements. The great cities fell silent. The writing system was no longer used. Within a few generations, it was as if the Harappan civilization had never existed. Why? The theories are numerous and none is fully satisfying. Climate change is a leading candidate. Evidence from geological surveys and satellite imagery suggests that the monsoon patterns shifted during this period, reducing rainfall in the Indus region. The Gagga-Hakra river system, which many scholars identify with the mythical Sarasvati River mentioned in ancient Sanskrit texts, appears to have dried up or changed course dramatically around this time. Without reliable river flow, the agricultural base of the civilization would have collapsed. But other factors may have contributed. Tectonic activity, always a possibility in this geologically active region, may have altered river courses. Soil salinization from centuries of irrigation may have reduced crop yields. Trade disruptions with Mesopotamia, perhaps caused by political instability in the Near East, may have weakened the economic system. Epidemic disease, always a threat in dense urban populations without modern sanitation, is another possibility. But here is the problem. None of these explanations fully accounts for the totality of the collapse. Cities have survived droughts. Trade disruptions damage economies, but do not typically erase them. Disease kills people, but does not destroy knowledge. The Harappan collapse was not just a demographic decline, it was a cultural erasure. The writing system was lost. The urban planning tradition was abandoned. The standardized material culture that had unified the civilization across hundreds of sites fragmented into local traditions with no memory of the whole. Whatever happened, it did not merely reduce the population, it severed the transmission of knowledge and practice that had sustained one of the greatest early civilizations in human history. The parallels with the Khmer are difficult to ignore. A hydraulic civilization dependent on water management, a period of climate instability, a gradual decline rather than a sudden catastrophe, and a completeness of forgetting that seems disproportionate to the scale of what was lost. The second case takes us to North America, to the arid canyons of the American Southwest. There, the ancestral Puebloan people built a civilization of remarkable sophistication between roughly the 9th and 13th centuries of the Common Era. Their great houses, multi-story stone structures containing hundreds of rooms, still stand in places like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, Mesa Verde in Colorado, and Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. These were not simple shelters. They were planned, multifunctional complexes that serve simultaneously as residences, ceremonial centers, storage facilities, and administrative hubs. Chaco Canyon was the hub of a regional network that connected communities across thousands of square kilometers. Roads, perfectly straight and up to 9 meters wide, radiated out from Chaco to outlying settlements or great houses at distances of 50 to 100 kilometers. More than 250 kilometers of roads have been identified, and many more are believed to exist but remain unverified. These roads did not follow natural terrain. They cut straight across the landscape, climbing mesas and descending into canyons in rigidly straight lines. In a culture without wheeled vehicles and without draft animals, The construction of these roads represents an enormous investment of communal labor. The Chacoans imported timber for construction from forests more than 80 kilometers distant, carrying individual logs on their backs across the desert. More than 200,000 individual timbers were used in the construction of the major great houses, including ponderosa pine logs weighing up to 300 kilograms each. They developed astronomical alignments of impressive precision, with buildings oriented to mark solstices, equinoxes, and lunar standstills. They created a trade network that brought turquoise from distant mines, macaw feathers and copper bells from Mesoamerica more than 2,000 kilometers to the south, and marine shells from the Pacific coast. And then, in the late 12th and 13th centuries, the great houses were abandoned. The population migrated south and east, eventually settling in the Pueblo communities along the Rio Grande and in the Hopi mesas of Arizona, where their descendants live today. The reasons again appear to involve drought. Tree ring records from the region, among the most detailed and long-running in the world, show a severe and prolonged drought beginning in approximately 1275, known as the Great Drought. For more than 23 years, rainfall in the region was dramatically below normal. In a landscape that was already semi-arid, where the margin between sufficiency and scarcity was razor-thin, this was devastating. But drought alone does not explain the abandonment. The ancestral Puebloans had survived previous droughts, including a severe one in the 1130s, that may have contributed to the decline of Chaco itself. What made the late 13th century drought different? Some scholars point to social factors that had accumulated over the preceding decades. Evidence of violence at several late-period sites suggests increasing conflict. Defensive architecture, including towers and walls at previously unfortified sites, indicates a society under threat, whether from external enemies or internal strife. Resource competition in a shrinking environment may have shattered the cooperative networks that had sustained the culture. The numbers are striking. A community that had sustained tens of thousands of people across a vast network of settlements contracted within 2 to 3 generations to a much smaller and more dispersed population. The third case takes us to the tropical lowlands of Mesoamerica. The classic Maya civilization, spanning from roughly the 3rd to the 9th centuries of the Common Era, produced some of the most impressive cultural achievements of the pre-Columbian Americas. The Maya built monumental cities with pyramids reaching over 70 meters in height, elaborate palace complexes, ball courts for the ritual sport of ulama, and astronomical observatories that tracked the movements of celestial bodies with precision that modern scientists have verified. They developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the pre-Columbian world, a fully phonetic script that has now been substantially deciphered, revealing a rich literary tradition of history, mythology, and royal propaganda. They calculated calendrical cycles of extraordinary complexity, projecting dates millions of years into the past and future. Their mathematical system included the concept of zero, developed independently from the Old World. The major classic Maya cities were substantial. Tikal, in modern Guatemala, had a population estimated at between 60,000 and 120,000 at its peak. Calakmul, its great rival, was comparable in size. Copan, Palenque, Caracol, Uxmal, each was a major urban center with populations in the tens of thousands. The total population of the Maya lowlands during the late Classic period may have reached several million people. And then, beginning in the 9th century, the cities of the southern lowlands were abandoned, one by one. New construction ceased. The erection of dated stelae, the carved stone monuments that recorded royal events, stopped. The last known long count date at any major southern lowland site corresponds to roughly 909 of the Common Era. The jungle moved in. Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, cities that had thrived for centuries, fell silent within a span of roughly 150 years. The Maya collapse has generated as many theories as any mystery in archaeology. Drought is once again a leading contender. Sediment cores from lakes in the Yucatan Peninsula show evidence of severe and prolonged droughts during the 9th and 10th centuries, precisely the period of the collapse. Isotopic analysis of stalagmites in cave systems confirms the same pattern. Deforestation, driven by the clearing of forest for agricultural land and for fuel to fire limestone plaster, may have exacerbated the drought by reducing local rainfall and increasing soil erosion. Warfare between competing city-states intensified dramatically in the late Classic period, draining resources, disrupting trade, and forcing populations into conflict over increasingly scarce resources. Political fragmentation weakened the ability of individual kingdoms to organize large-scale responses to environmental stress. And it gets stranger. The Maya did not disappear as a people. Millions of Maya live in Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, and Honduras today. They speak more than 30 distinct Maya languages. They practice traditions that descend, however transformed, from the Classic period. But the urban civilization, the monumental architecture, the fully developed writing system, the elaborate political hierarchy of divine kings and noble courts, that was lost. The descendants of the Maya survived. The civilization they once maintained did not. The writing system was still in limited use when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, but the vast majority of Maya books had already been lost. Of the thousands that once existed, only 4 codices, books written on bark paper, survive today. 4 books from an entire civilization. Everything else was destroyed by time, by humidity, by insects, and later by the deliberate burning ordered by Spanish colonial priests. The 4th case comes from the seas of the ancient world, around 1200 before the Common Era. A period of catastrophic upheaval swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian records describe attacks by a confederation of maritime raiders known to modern scholars only as the Sea Peoples. The pharaoh Rameses III recorded his battles against them on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, and his inscriptions name several of the groups involved: the Peleset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, among others. But these names have been only tentatively linked to known ethnic groups, and their origins remain debated. What is not debated is the scale of the destruction. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient world, which had rivaled Egypt for dominance of the Near East for centuries, collapsed entirely and never recovered. Its capital, Hattusa, was burned and abandoned. Cities along the Levantine coast, including the great trading port of Ugarit, were destroyed. The palace economies of the Late Bronze Age, which had sustained a complex web of international trade connecting Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Greece, and Cyprus, disintegrated within a few decades. Eric Klein, an archaeologist at George Washington University, who has studied this period extensively, argued in his influential book on the subject that the Bronze Age collapse was not caused by the Sea Peoples alone. It was the result of multiple interconnected factors hitting simultaneously: earthquakes along the Anatolian fault zone, drought across the eastern Mediterranean, the disruption of the international tin trade that was essential for bronze production, internal rebellions by populations stressed by famine and taxation, and the breakdown of the diplomatic systems that had maintained stability among the great powers. The Sea Peoples may have been a symptom as much as a cause. Displaced populations pushed into migration by the very environmental and economic forces that were destabilizing the entire region. The 5th case brings us back to the Americas. Cahokia, located near the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers in what is now the state of Illinois, was the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. At its peak, around 1100 of the Common Era, it had a population estimated at between 10,000 and 20,000, with some estimates reaching as high as 40,000 when surrounding settlements are included. Its central feature was Monk's Mound, a massive earthen platform covering more than 6 hectares at its base and rising roughly 30 meters above the surrounding floodplain. Monk's Mound contains an estimated 620,000 cubic meters of earth, all of it carried and placed by hand, basket by basket. Cahokia was not a village that happened to build a big mound. It was a planned urban centre with a grand central plaza covering roughly 19 hectares, an area large enough to hold multiple football fields. Residential neighbourhoods were arranged in distinct patterns suggesting social stratification. A wooden palisade wall with projecting bastions surrounded the central precinct, rebuilt several times during the city's history. A series of timber post circles, dubbed Woodhenge by archaeologists, served as solar calendars, marking the positions of sunrise throughout the year with the precision needed for agricultural scheduling and ceremonial timing. Cahokia's influence extended far beyond its immediate surroundings. Cahokian-style pottery, shell bead work, chunky game stones, and distinctive architectural forms have been found at sites across the Midwest and the Southeast, from Wisconsin to the Gulf Coast, from Oklahoma to the Appalachian foothills. Whether this influence was political, commercial, religious, or some combination remains debated. What is clear is that Cahokia was the center of a cultural network that connected communities across a vast region. And by 1300, Cahokia was abandoned. The population peaked around 1100 and began to decline by 1200. By 1250, major construction had ceased. By 1300, the site was empty or nearly so. The reasons follow the now familiar pattern. Environmental degradation, including deforestation of the surrounding uplands that led to erosion and sediment deposition in the adjacent bottomlands. Flooding of the Mississippi floodplain that disrupted agriculture. Climate change, specifically the transition from the relatively warm and stable medieval climate anomaly to the cooler and more variable conditions of the Little Ice Age. Political instability, as suggested by the construction and rebuilding of the Palisade Wall, and the strains inherent in sustaining a large concentrated population in a pre-industrial setting, including waste disposal, sanitation, and disease. Now here is what these 5 cases, the Indus Valley, the ancestral Puebloans, the classic Maya, the Bronze Age Mediterranean, and Cahokia, share with the Khmer. In each case, a complex society developed sophisticated systems for managing its environment and sustaining its population. In each case, those systems worked brilliantly for centuries, enabling population growth, cultural elaboration, monumental construction, and the accumulation of specialized knowledge. In each case, environmental stress, often driven by climate shifts outside the range the system was designed for, placed pressure on those systems. In each case, the environmental stress interacted with internal social, political, and economic vulnerabilities to create a cascade of failure that the society could not arrest. And in each case, the collapse was followed by a period of forgetting so profound that later generations could barely comprehend what had been lost. But here is the problem. If we look at these cases in isolation, each one can be explained by local factors. Drought here, invasion there, deforestation in one place, political fragmentation in another. Each case has its own particular history, its own specific circumstances. But when we look at them together, when we lay them side by side across continents and millennia, a pattern emerges that is harder to dismiss. Complex societies appear to have a characteristic vulnerability that is inherent in their very complexity. Joseph Tainter, an anthropologist at Utah State University, proposed in his influential 1988 study of societal collapse that complex societies fail because the returns on increasing complexity eventually diminish. Each new layer of bureaucracy, each new infrastructure project, each new institutional solution to a problem costs more than the one before it while delivering less marginal benefit. In the early stages of a society's development, investments in complexity pay enormous dividends. Building an irrigation system where none existed before dramatically increases food production. Establishing a legal system reduces conflict. Creating a trade network brings access to new resources. But over time, the easy gains are exhausted. Each additional canal brings less additional farmland. Each additional law addresses a more marginal problem. Each additional trade route yields diminishing returns. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining the existing complexity continues to grow, consuming an ever larger share of the society's resources. Eventually, Tainter argues, the cost of maintaining the system exceeds the society's ability to pay. At that point, simplification, which is what collapse looks like from the outside, becomes the rational response. People do not collapse because they are stupid or lazy or decadent. They simplify because the complexity has become more expensive than it is worth. They walk away from the canals, the temples, the trade networks, the bureaucracies, not because they have forgotten their value, but because maintaining them has become unsustainable. This framework fits the Khmer case with uncomfortable precision. The temple building program, grew more ambitious with each generation. Angkor Wat was followed by the Bayon, which was followed by Prom, Preah Khan, Ban Take Day, and dozens of other major projects, each one larger or more elaborate than the last. Each required enormous investments of labor, materials, and food. Each added to the maintenance burden of the state. Each demanded more from a water system already operating near its capacity limits. The last great builder king, Jayavarman VII, constructed more temples and public works than any of his predecessors combined. His reign is often described as the golden age of the Khmer Empire. But it may also have been the point at which the cost of complexity tipped past sustainability. The golden age may have been the tipping point. Something is wrong with our assumptions about progress. We tend to think of civilization as a one-way process, a steady climb from simplicity to complexity, from ignorance to knowledge, from scarcity to abundance. The Khmer Empire and the many other civilizations that followed the same arc, from rise to peak to fall, suggest otherwise. They suggest that complexity itself carries risk, that the systems we build to solve problems can become the problems, that the knowledge we accumulate can be lost, that the cities we build can be reclaimed by the forest. This is not science fiction. It has happened, repeatedly, across every continent, across thousands of years of recorded and unrecorded history. It is one of the most consistent patterns in the human record, and this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling. The deeper truth about the Khmer Empire, and about the many civilizations that have followed a similar trajectory, is not simply that they collapsed. Civilizations collapse. That is dramatic but comprehensible. The deeper truth is that they were forgotten, and the forgetting is, in many ways, more disturbing than the collapse itself. Consider what it means to forget a civilization of 1 million people. Not to forget a single building or a single king's name, but to forget the entire web of relationships, practices, knowledge, and beliefs that sustained a complex society for over 600 years. The farmers who knew which rice varieties grew best in which soils, at which elevations, in which seasons. The engineers who understood the precise slope gradients needed for canal flow, the compaction methods for embankment construction, the sedimentation rates of different soil types. The priests who maintained the calendrical systems and knew the timing of every ritual in a religious calendar spanning hundreds of ceremonies. The dancers who preserved the choreography of the Apsara dances, movements that told stories reaching back centuries. The physicians who knew which plants treated which ailments, knowledge accumulated through generations of observation and practice. The administrators who tracked the temple estates, the labor obligations, the tax revenues, the grain stores, the census of households. All of this, the accumulated practical wisdom of hundreds of generations, vanished. It did not vanish because the people all died, though many did die, and many more migrated. It vanished because the context in which that knowledge had meaning ceased to exist. An engineer's understanding of canal maintenance is useless without a canal system to maintain. A priest's knowledge of temple ritual is irrelevant without a temple economy to sustain it. A dancer's choreography cannot survive without an audience, a court, and a tradition of performance to give it purpose. When the system collapses, the knowledge that was embedded in the system collapses with it. It is not written down in a portable form that can be carried to a new place and a new context. It exists only in practice, in the daily actions of people doing their work, in the apprenticeships and traditions passed from master to student, from parent to child, from elder to youth. When the chain of transmission breaks, the knowledge dies with the last person who held it. Let that sink in. 6 centuries of accumulated expertise, the product of millions of individual lives spent learning, practicing, refining, and teaching, erased within a few generations, not by war, not by plague, not by a deliberate act of destruction, but by the simple cessation of the practices that kept that knowledge alive, by the ending of the context that gave that knowledge its meaning. The Khmer case illustrates a fundamental truth about human knowledge that we rarely confront. We tend to think of knowledge as a thing, an object that, once created, persists. We think of books, libraries, databases, digital archives. We imagine that once something is known, it stays known. But the vast majority of human knowledge throughout history has not been stored in books. It has been stored in people, in the hands of the craftsman shaping a tool, in the eyes of the farmer reading the sky for signs of rain, in the feet of the dancer performing a sequence learned from her mother, who learned it from her mother before her, in the voice of the storyteller, holding an audience through the night. This kind of knowledge, procedural knowledge, embodied knowledge, tacit knowledge, cannot be fully captured in a written text. You can describe how to ride a bicycle in words, but you cannot learn to ride a bicycle from a book. You learn by doing, and when the doing stops, the knowing stops with it. The Khmer are far from the only example of this kind of knowledge loss. The technique for making Roman concrete, the opus caementicium that used volcanic ash to create a material that hardened underwater and has proved, in marine environments, to be more durable than modern Portland cement, was lost for over a millennium. Roman engineers understood, through practice and tradition, which proportions of ash, lime, and seawater produced the strongest results. When the Roman construction industry declined, that practical knowledge faded. Modern materials scientists have only recently begun to understand the chemistry involved, and they have done so through analysis of surviving Roman structures, not through any continuity of tradition. The method for producing Damascus steel, with its distinctive watered pattern and its legendary combination of hardness and flexibility, was lost in the 18th century. Swordsmiths in Syria and India had produced this material for centuries, but the process was never fully documented in a way that allowed reproduction. When the tradition of production ended, the knowledge went with it. Modern metallurgists have produced approximations, but have not been able to replicate the original process exactly. The engineering knowledge that built the great aqueducts and road systems of the Roman Empire was not passed down in any systematic way after the empire fragmented. Medieval Europeans lived among Roman ruins they could not replicate. They walked on Roman roads they could not repair. They crossed Roman bridges they could not replace when they fell. The knowledge was not suppressed, it simply was not maintained. In each case, the loss was not the result of suppression or destruction. It was the result of disuse. Knowledge that is not practiced is not maintained. Skills that are not taught are not learned. Traditions that are not performed are not preserved. The default state of human knowledge is not persistence, it is loss. Preservation is the exception. Forgetting is the rule. This is not science fiction, this is documented history. The LiDAR surveys that have revolutionized our understanding of Angkor have revealed something else that deepens this sense of loss. Beneath the jungle canopy, the surveys have identified not just temples and canals, but entire urban landscapes, residential areas, industrial zones, quarries, roads, field boundaries, and occupation mounds that were previously invisible. The population of the greater Angkor area was not concentrated in a single city centre surrounded by empty countryside. It was dispersed across a low-density urban landscape, a pattern that some scholars have compared to modern suburban sprawl. People lived in wooden houses raised on stilts, surrounded by garden plots and fruit trees, connected by a network of roads and waterways to the temple complexes and reservoirs that formed the monumental anchors of the landscape. What this means is that the Angkor we see today, the stone temples rising from the jungle, is only the skeleton of what once existed. The flesh of the city, the wooden houses, the thatched roofs, the market stalls, the workshops, the gardens, the animal pens, the children playing in the shade of palm trees is gone. And with it has gone the evidence of how ordinary Khmer people actually lived their daily lives. We know a great deal about the kings and the gods they worshipped. We know almost nothing about the farmers who grew the rice, the potters who made the vessels, the weavers who produced the cloth, the mothers who raised the children, the teachers who educated the young. The archaeological record is biased towards stone, toward permanence, toward the monumental, the everyday, the human, the intimate, the warm that is lost. Let that sink in. We have the bones of this civilization. We do not have its soul. And this brings us to a question that reaches beyond archaeology and into the heart of philosophy. What does it mean for a civilization to exist if no one remembers it? The temples of Angkor are physical objects. They occupy space. They can be measured, surveyed, photographed, and studied. But a civilization is not a collection of buildings. It is a web of relationships, a system of meanings, a shared understanding of how the world works and how people should live in it. When that web is broken and that understanding is lost, does the civilization still exist in any meaningful sense, or is it merely a ruin? A set of stones that happens to have been arranged by human hands, but has lost the meaning that once made those stones more than stones. The reality is messier and more instructive than any simple narrative. The Khmer civilization did not vanish completely, it transformed. The Cambodian people of today are the descendants of the Khmer Empire. Their language, Khmer, descends directly from the language spoken at Angkor. Their religious practices carry traces of the empire. The Cambodian classical dance tradition preserves gestures and movements that appear in the bas reliefs of Angkor Wat, but no one knows exactly how the dances were performed 800 years ago. The modern tradition is a reconstruction, a best guess, based on visual evidence and fragments of oral tradition. It is beautiful and deeply meaningful to those who practice it. But it is not the same as the original. Something has been lost in the transmission, something that can never be recovered because the chain that carried it was broken. The implications extend far beyond Cambodia. We live in a world of extraordinary complexity. Our food systems, our energy systems, our communication networks, our financial systems, all of these are more intricate and more interdependent than anything the Khmer ever built. And yet the principle remains the same. Complexity creates capability, but it also creates vulnerability. The more complex the system, the more points of failure it contains. The more specialized the knowledge required to maintain it, the more fragile that knowledge becomes. The more dependent the system is on conditions remaining within a particular range, the more vulnerable it is to changes that push conditions outside that range. We assume our knowledge is safe because it is written down, stored in books and databases and digital archives. But the Khmer wrote things down too, on palm leaves that rotted in the monsoon humidity. The Romans wrote things down too, in libraries that burned. The Maya wrote things down too, in books that were deliberately destroyed. Writing is not a guarantee of preservation. It is a tool, and like all tools, it can fail. Then something happened that changed everything in how we understand these disappearances. LiDAR and remote sensing revealed that what we once thought were isolated pockets of civilization in the tropics were in fact parts of much larger networks of settlement and transformation. In the Amazon basin, areas long thought to be pristine wilderness have been shown to contain the remains of extensive human modification, raised fields, earthworks, managed forests, and even large settlements. In Central America, LiDAR surveys have revealed Maya cities far larger than previously known, with populations that may need to be revised sharply upward. In Southeast Asia, beyond Angkor, similar surveys have identified other large-scale settlements, roads, and water management systems beneath the forest canopy. The jungle is not a wilderness. It is a graveyard of civilizations, and each of those civilizations carried knowledge, traditions, and practices that are now irrecoverably lost. The scale of this loss is almost impossible to comprehend. We cannot inventory what we do not know we have lost. We can only see the shadows, the ruins, the fragments, and wonder at the whole. What does it mean to live in a world where civilizations of 1 million people can be forgotten? Where entire systems of knowledge can be erased not by violence but by the simple passage of time and the cessation of practice? What does the fate of the Khmer Empire say about our relationship to the past, to the future, and to the fragile structures of knowledge and infrastructure that sustain our own way of life? These are not abstract questions suitable only for academic seminars. They are practical ones. The Khmer Empire lasted 600 years. 600 years is a long time by any measure. It is roughly the length of time from the late medieval period to the present day. Imagine the entirety of European history from the 14th century onward: the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the Age of Electricity, the Age of Flight, the Digital Age. All of that, compressed into a single civilizational arc, and then erased. Not partially damaged, not partially forgotten, erased. The language is still spoken in some form, the land still inhabited, but the substance of the civilization, the systems that made it function, The knowledge that made those systems possible, gone from the collective memory of its own descendants. This is what happened to the Khmer, and it happened despite the fact that they built in stone, that they carved their history into temple walls, that they constructed monuments explicitly designed to endure across the ages. The stone survived, the knowledge did not, the temples stand. The civilization that gave them meaning is a ghost inhabiting its own ruins. There is a particular kind of melancholy in walking through the ruins of Angkor. It is not the melancholy of visiting a battlefield or a graveyard, places associated with specific acts of violence or specific moments of grief. It is a deeper, quieter sadness, the sadness of encountering something that was once full of life, full of meaning, full of the warmth of human purpose, and is now empty. The faces of the Bayons smile down from their towers, serene and unknowable, their expressions unchanged for 8 centuries, their meaning debated by scholars who can never ask the people who carved them what they intended. The Apsaras dance on the walls of Angkor Wat, frozen in mid-gesture, their music silenced, their audience gone, their names unrecorded. The canals that once carried water to 1 million people now carry only mud and fallen leaves, and the reflections of clouds passing overhead. We stand before these ruins and we feel something, a mixture of awe and loss that is difficult to put into words. It is the feeling of recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that everything we build is temporary, that the institutions we create, the knowledge we accumulate, the cultures we sustain, all of these exist only as long as we actively maintain them. The moment we stop, the moment the chain of maintenance and transmission breaks, the process of erasure begins. Not with a bang, not with a dramatic event, but with a slow, patient silence that fills the space where human voices used to be. This is not a comfortable truth. We prefer to believe in progress, in the steady accumulation of knowledge and capability, in the forward march of civilization toward ever greater heights. And in many ways, this belief is justified. We do know more in some domains than our ancestors. We do have capabilities they lacked. We have written more, stored more, connected more. But the Khmer had capabilities we lacked too. They had an intimate understanding of their monsoon environment, a mastery of hydraulic engineering adapted to tropical conditions, a knowledge of rice cultivations refined over centuries of practice that we are only beginning to reconstruct through archaeological research. Some of that knowledge, the specific techniques and local adaptations, may have been more advanced in its particular domain than anything we currently possess. The lesson of the Khmer is not that civilization is doomed. It is that civilization is fragile. It requires constant tending, constant renewal, constant attention to the systems that sustain it. The moment a society begins to take its infrastructure for granted, the moment it stops investing in maintenance, the moment it allows its knowledge base to narrow and its institutional memory to fade, the slow process of decline has already begun. Not visibly, not dramatically, but inevitably. Angkor's water system did not fail overnight. It deteriorated over decades, perhaps over more than a century, as maintenance was deferred, as resources were redirected to temple construction and military campaigns, as the pool of people with the specialized skills needed to repair the system shrank. By the time the crisis became undeniable, the system was too degraded, too compromised in too many places to save. The failure was not a lack of knowledge at the outset. It was a failure of attention sustained over time. A failure to prioritize the unglamorous work of maintenance over the glamorous work of creation. There is a modern term for this: deferred maintenance. It refers to the practice of postponing repairs and upkeep to save money or resources in the short term, at the inevitable cost of greater expense and eventual failure in the long term. Every engineer understands the concept. Every homeowner knows it in their bones. A roof that is not repaired develops a leak. A leak that is not fixed causes rot in the beams beneath it. Rot that is not addressed leads to structural failure. The process is gradual, predictable, and preventable, but only if someone pays attention. Only if someone does the work. Only if the work of maintenance is valued as highly as the work of creation. The Khmer, in the end, stopped doing the work. Not because they were lazy or ignorant or decadent, but because the work became too much. The system had grown too large, too complex, too interdependent for a society, under simultaneous environmental, political, economic, and religious stress to maintain. And when the climate shifted and the rains became unreliable, the margin of error disappeared. There was no slack in the system, no reserve capacity, no room for deferred maintenance in a network operating at its limits under conditions it was not designed for. This pattern carries a message for the present that is difficult to ignore. We live in a world of systems, systems of infrastructure, systems of knowledge, systems of governance, systems of ecology, that are more complex and more interconnected than anything the Khmer built. Our cities are larger, our populations are denser, our supply chains are longer and more fragile. Our dependencies on systems we do not fully understand are deeper than most of us realize, and our knowledge of those systems is, in many cases, concentrated in a remarkably small number of specialists. Most people do not know how the water treatment plant in their city works. Most people could not explain how electricity reaches their home. Most people have no idea how the global food supply chain functions or how close it operates to capacity. This knowledge exists, but it exists in narrow channels, held by specialists whose expertise would be difficult to replace quickly if the chain of training and practice were ever disrupted. Angkor reminds us that the greatest threat to a civilization is not the dramatic catastrophe, the invasion, the earthquake, the plague. It is the slow accumulation of small failures, each one too minor to demand urgent attention, but together sufficient to bring down the whole. It is the canal that is not dredged this year, the embankment that is not reinforced this decade, the training program that is not funded this budget cycle, the maintenance schedule that is deferred in favor of a new construction project. These are not heroic failures. They are quiet ones. They happen in offices and committee rooms. They happen because short-term priorities overwhelm long-term needs. And they are, for that very reason, the most dangerous kind of all. In the jungle of northwestern Cambodia, the strangler figs continue their slow work. Their roots pour over carved lintels like liquid stone, splitting walls that were placed with precision by hands that have been dust for centuries. Moss covers the faces of kings, whose names are known only from inscriptions that most of the world has never read. Birdsong fills halls that once echoed with chanting, with the rustling of silk robes, with the murmur of scholars debating, with the laughter of children playing in the courtyards. The birds do not know what these halls once were. They know only that the stones provide shelter, that the crevices harbour insects, that the canopy above filters the light into the soft green glow of the forest interior. Angkor endures, not because anyone maintained it through the centuries of silence, but because stone endures. That is its nature. The temples are still there, rising from the forest floor with a patience that mirrors the patience of the trees that engulf them. They do not ask to be remembered. They do not demand attention. They do not reproach the generations that forgot them. They simply are monuments to a civilization that created something extraordinary and then gradually, imperceptibly, over the course of a century or more, let it slip away, not in a single dramatic moment of failure, but in a long, slow exhale, a relaxing of the grip that had held everything in place, until the forest, which had been waiting all along, moved in to fill the silence. The Khmer Empire lasted more than 600 years. For most of that span, it was one of the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations on the planet. Its engineers built water systems that fed a population comparable to the largest European cities of the time. Its artists created carvings of such beauty and precision that they still stop visitors in their tracks, 8 centuries later, in the green half-light of the jungle. Its kings commanded armies and orchestrated the construction of monuments that remain among the largest ever built by human hands, anywhere on the surface of the earth. Its scholars maintained traditions of learning in universities of stone. Its dancers performed choreographies that told the stories of gods and heroes. And yet, within a few lifetimes of its peak, the Khmer Empire was reduced to ruins in the forest, its canals filled with silt, its reservoirs dried and then flooded and then dried again, unchecked by the engineers who had once managed them with such skill. Its wooden city, the real city where the people had lived, rotted back into the earth. Its palm leaf libraries, where the accumulated knowledge of 6 centuries had been recorded, dissolved in the monsoon rains. And the people who remained, the farmers and monks and villagers who continued to live in the shadow of the temples, carried with them only fragments of the story, fragments that would be misunderstood by outsiders, fragments that could not convey the scale, the complexity, the sheer ambition of what had once existed in this place. This is the story of the Khmer Empire, but it is also, in a deeper sense, the story of every civilization that has ever existed. Every human community that has built something complex has faced the same fundamental challenge: how to sustain what has been created, how to pass on what has been learned, how to maintain the systems that make everything possible, not just for a year, not just for a generation, but across the centuries. And the record of history, read clearly and without illusion, tells us that most have failed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, in the way that a great tree falls, not from a single blow of the axe, but from 1,000 small wounds that weaken it until a storm that it would once have weathered without a tremor brings it crashing to the ground. The temples of Angkor do not preach, they do not warn, they do not offer lessons wrapped in language we can easily digest. They simply stand, half buried in the green embrace of the jungle, bearing witness to what was and what is no longer. They tell us, in a language that requires no translator and no scholar to interpret, that the things we build are not forever, that the knowledge we hold is not secure merely because we hold it now, that the civilizations we inhabit are not guaranteed to outlast the trees. And yet there is something in the story of the Khmer that is not entirely dark. The temples survive. The dance survives, in new forms, carried forward by performers who may not know the original choreography, but who carry in their movements an echo of something ancient. The language survives. The people survive. The Cambodian nation that exists today carries within it the genetic continuity, the cultural echoes, the linguistic roots of the empire that built Angkor. The chain was strained almost to breaking. The chain was stretched across centuries of silence and forgetting and colonial misunderstanding. But it held. Barely. Just barely. It held. There is a temple at Angkor called Priya Khan. It was built by Jayavarman VII as a monastery and university, a place of learning that once housed more than 1,000 teachers. Its corridors are long and dim. Its stones are cool to the touch, even in the heat of the Cambodian afternoon. In its inner sanctuaries, carvings of scholars and attendants line the walls, frozen in postures of study and devotion, holding books that have long since crumbled, gesturing toward texts that no living person can read. It is a monument to the idea that knowledge matters, that learning is worthy of the grandest expression a society can offer, that the mind deserves a temple of its own. Today, Priya Khan is quiet. The teachers are gone. The students are gone. The palm leaf manuscripts they studied are gone. What remains is the architecture of aspiration, the physical form of a belief that knowledge should be preserved, that wisdom should be housed in beauty, that the work of the mind is as sacred as the work of the hands that shaped the stone. This is what we inherit from the Khmer, not their specific knowledge, which is largely lost, not their political system, which is entirely gone, not their hydraulic technology, which we understand only in outline. What we inherit is a reminder carved in stone and wrapped in the roots of ancient trees, a reminder that what we know, what we build, what we create, exist only as long as we tend it. That maintenance is not a lesser act than creation, that the preservation of knowledge is as noble as its discovery, that the work of sustaining a civilization is never finished. The jungle does not rest. The roots continue to grow. The stones continue to crack. And somewhere in the silence between the birdsong and the wind, in the long corridors of Priya Khan and the shadowed galleries of the Bayon, if you stand very still and listen with more than your ears, you can almost hear the echo of a civilization that once filled this forest with the sound of 1,000,000 lives. The echo of water flowing through canals, the echo of rice being harvested, the echo of prayers offered to gods whose names were carved in stone so they would never be forgotten. It is quiet now. It has been quiet for a very long time. And that silence, that vast and patient silence, is the most important thing the Khmer Empire has to teach us. Not about what they built, not about why they fell, but about how quickly the sound of a living civilization can fade into the stillness of the trees. How quickly the familiar can become the forgotten. How quickly a world of voices can become a world of stone. The stones remember what we have forgotten, and one day they too will be gone.